Emily Grace's disappearance, 1981. Emily Grace was just 13 years old when she vanished without a trace from her family home in Seaside, California, in the summer of 1981. It was a quiet, military town neighborhood where the comings and goings of families stationed nearby were unremarkable. Emily, described by those who knew her as a bright but quiet child with a love for animals, had spent much of her young life navigating the instability of a troubled home. Her stepfather, Thomas Lane, a strict and sometimes volatile man, had recently returned from a deployment. Emily's mother, Margaret Lane, often appeared overwhelmed, balancing the demands of a large family and a husband with a temper. Emily and her siblings, including her younger sister, Lila Harper, had learned to tread carefully in a household where tension often simmered just below the surface. The night Emily disappeared seemed unremarkable at first. The family had returned from an evening outing, except for Emily, who stayed home. When they arrived, however, the atmosphere in the house had changed. The family dog, typically lively and energetic, was found sick and dying in the kitchen. According to Thomas, he immediately accused Emily of poisoning the animal, an accusation that sparked a violent confrontation. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery. Lila recalls seeing Emily that night with blood on her face and tears in her eyes, but by morning her sister was gone. When Lila asked about Emily's absence, Margaret quickly silenced her, telling her not to speak of it. The phrase, "we don't talk about Emily," became an unspoken rule in the Lane household, casting a shadow of silence and secrecy over the family. Strangely, Emily's disappearance was never reported to authorities. Neighbors barely noticed the absence of the young girl, who had rarely ventured beyond her front yard. Her school records showed no enrollment in California, and there were no missing person posters or police bulletins seeking information about her whereabouts. For all intents and purposes, Emily Grace had vanished off the face of the earth, as Lila later described it. Decades later, the haunting question would remain: what really happened to Emily Grace that night? Her disappearance was the beginning of a mystery that would stretch over 20 years, unraveling secrets, lies, and suspicions that would leave everyone involved wondering if the truth would ever come to light. Dysfunctional family background. Emily Grace's childhood was anything but ordinary. Growing up in the Lane household, she experienced a life filled with instability, fear, and neglect. Her mother, Margaret Lane, had always struggled to provide a stable environment for her children. Married multiple times and often facing financial challenges, Margaret appeared ill-equipped to manage the emotional and physical needs of her family. By the time Emily was born, Margaret had already been through years of tumultuous relationships, and her new marriage to Thomas Lane only added another layer of complexity. Thomas, a military man, brought a sense of structure to the family, but it came at a high cost. He was known for his strict discipline, often crossing the line into outright aggression. His temper was quick to flare, and the children learned early on to stay out of his way. Emily, with her quiet yet defiant nature, seemed to bear the brunt of his anger. According to Emily's younger sister, Lila Harper, there were many nights when the household would erupt into shouting matches, leaving the children frightened and huddled together in their shared bedroom. The dysfunction in the Lane household wasn't limited to emotional turmoil. The family moved frequently due to Thomas's military assignments, uprooting the children from schools and friendships with little notice. This transient lifestyle left Emily feeling unmoored and isolated, unable to form lasting connections outside her family. She and her siblings were often left to fend for themselves, with Margaret preoccupied by her own struggles and Thomas focused on his career. Emily's early years were further complicated by a series of placements in foster care. Child Protective Services had intervened more than once, citing neglect and abuse in the home. Emily, Lila, and their older sister Sarah Collins were separated during these periods, deepening the fractures in their already fragile family bonds. Sarah, who was adopted by a foster family, later recalled how heartbreaking it was to leave her sisters behind. "I always worried about them," she said. "I knew they were still living in chaos, and there was nothing I could do to help." When Emily was eventually returned to the Lane household, it became clear that the system had failed her. Her stepfather's temper had not improved, and Margaret seemed unwilling or unable to protect her children from his outbursts. Emily, caught between her desire to escape and her loyalty to her siblings, became increasingly withdrawn. She spent more and more time in her room, finding solace in books and daydreaming about a life far away from Seaside. The dysfunction reached a tipping point in the months leading up to Emily's disappearance. According to Sarah, who later pieced together accounts from family members, tensions in the household were at an all-time high. Emily's rebellious streak had begun to show, and she no longer seemed willing to quietly endure Thomas's harsh punishments. Margaret, rather than stepping in to mediate, appeared to distance herself further, leaving Emily to fend for herself. In hindsight, the warning signs were all there. A household filled with anger, fear, and neglect created the perfect storm for a tragedy. Emily's disappearance in 1981 wasn't just the loss of a child. It was the culmination of years of dysfunction, a heartbreaking reminder of a family that had fallen apart long before she vanished. The question that would haunt everyone in the years to come was whether the system, her family, or anyone else could have done something to save her before it was too late. Initial investigation, 2002. It wasn't until 2 decades after Emily Grace's disappearance that someone decided to demand answers. That person was Sarah Collins, Emily's older sister, who had long felt the weight of her siblings' absence. Now an adult, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had gone terribly wrong all those years ago. Why had no one looked for Emily? Why had her disappearance been swept under the rug? With these questions in mind, Sarah filed a missing persons report in 2002, determined to uncover the truth. For the local police in Seaside, California, the case presented a unique challenge. By the time the report was filed, any trail of evidence had long gone cold. There were no records of Emily ever being reported missing by her family, no school records to track, and no witnesses who remembered seeing her in the neighborhood. The Grace Lane family had moved away shortly after Emily's disappearance, leaving behind little more than a vague impression on the community. Neighbors barely remembered them, and those who did could only recall a family that kept to themselves. Detective Michael Rivera was assigned to the case and quickly realized that this was no ordinary missing persons report. The family's silence over the years was deeply unsettling, Rivera later recalled. It was as if Emily had been erased from existence. One of the first red flags was the absence of any official documentation about Emily's life or disappearance. Her parents, Thomas and Margaret Lane, had never contacted the police or made an effort to search for her. To Rivera, this was highly unusual. Most parents would move heaven and earth to find their missing child, he said, but in this case it seemed like they'd simply moved on. Rivera began his investigation by interviewing Sarah, who shared what little she knew about Emily's final days. Her memories were fragmented, colored by the fear and confusion of a child growing up in a tumultuous household. "I remember asking my mom about Emily," Sarah told Rivera. "She told me not to talk about it, that we weren't supposed to mention her name. It was like she'd never existed." Sarah's testimony painted a disturbing picture of a family that had deliberately chosen to bury the past, both figuratively and literally. As Rivera dug deeper, he discovered more troubling details. Emily's younger sister, Lila Harper, recalled a strict rule imposed by their stepfather. The children were forbidden from going near a certain area in the backyard. "He said we weren't allowed to play there," Lila told Rivera. "At the time, I didn't think much of it, but now it feels like he was hiding something." Armed with this information, Rivera sought permission to search the family's former property. In 2002, a team of cadaver dogs was brought to the site, and their reactions were chilling. The dogs alerted to a specific spot in the backyard near an old tree, suggesting the presence of human remains. As investigators began to dig, anticipation grew. Could this be the break they were looking for? But after hours of careful excavation, they found no body. What they did uncover, however, was a small, weathered girl's shoe, an object that sent shivers down Rivera's spine. It was the kind of shoe a child Emily's age might have worn, he later said. Finding it there, buried, felt like a clue we couldn't ignore. Despite the lack of a body, the discovery of the shoe added weight to Sarah's suspicions. Rivera began to focus more intensely on Emily's parents, Thomas and Margaret Lane, whose behavior over the years seemed increasingly suspect. Why hadn't they reported Emily missing? Why had they refused to speak about her? And what secrets might they be hiding? For Sarah, the reopening of Emily's case in 2002 was a bittersweet moment. On one hand, she was relieved that someone was finally taking her sister's disappearance seriously. On the other hand, it forced her to confront the painful reality of what might have happened to Emily. "I just want to know the truth," Sarah said. "Whatever it is, I need to know what happened to my sister." The investigation into Emily Grace's disappearance had only just begun, but one thing was clear. The silence surrounding her case spoke volumes. Detective Rivera and his team were determined to break that silence, no matter how long it had lasted. For Sarah, it was a glimmer of hope that, after 20 long years, justice for her sister might finally be within reach. The absence of a body didn't dampen Rivera's determination. To him, the shoe was a sign, a subtle but powerful indicator that Emily hadn't simply run away, as her parents had claimed. That shoe didn't just bury itself, Rivera remarked. Someone put it there, and it wasn't an accident. Further complicating the case was the behavior of Emily's stepfather, Thomas Lane. By all accounts, Thomas had a short temper and a history of violent outbursts. When questioned, his answers were evasive, his tone defensive. He repeatedly denied any involvement in Emily's disappearance, but made cryptic comments that set Rivera on edge. At one point, Thomas admitted he had been furious with Emily the night she vanished, accusing her of poisoning the family dog. The argument, by his own admission, had turned physical. "I hit her," he confessed, "but I didn't kill her." Thomas's wife, Margaret, was no less suspicious. When interviewed, she seemed nervous, her eyes darting around the room, as if searching for an escape. Margaret admitted that the family had kept receiving government checks in Emily's name for years after her disappearance, a revelation that raised questions about the family's financial motives. "We didn't mean to hurt anyone," she insisted, though her words offered little clarity. For Rivera, the puzzle pieces were falling into place. Emily hadn't simply vanished. She had been erased. The shoe, the cadaver dogs, the family's silence. It all suggested a calculated effort to cover up the truth. Rivera couldn't shake the feeling that Emily's parents knew far more than they were letting on. Then there was the backyard itself. Lila Harper, Emily's younger sister, recounted how their stepfather had strictly forbidden the children from playing near the spot where the shoe was found. "He told us to stay away from there," Lila said, her voice trembling. "I didn't understand why back then, but now I think he was hiding something." Despite the mounting evidence, the investigation stalled. Without a body, prosecutors were hesitant to move forward, and the Lane family's secrets remained frustratingly out of reach. Rivera, however, wasn't ready to give up. "We may not have all the answers yet," he said, "but I believe we're closer to the truth than ever before." As the investigation continued, the shoe became a symbol of both hope and heartbreak, a reminder of the young girl who had disappeared so many years ago and the questions that still lingered in her absence. As Detective Michael Rivera dug deeper into the mysterious disappearance of Emily Grace, he began piecing together a troubling puzzle. The more he learned, the clearer it became that something sinister had taken place within the Lane household. The family's behavior, the gaps in Emily's story, and the whispers of long-buried secrets all pointed to a much darker truth. The first major break in the investigation came when Rivera brought cadaver dogs to the family's former home in Seaside. The backyard was overgrown and unkempt, but it still bore faint traces of the life the Lane family once lived there. For most people, the sight of the dogs sniffing the yard might seem uneventful, but when the animals zeroed in on a specific spot beneath an old tree, the air around the investigation changed. The dogs' handlers confirmed what Rivera feared. The animals were detecting human remains. The discovery set off a flurry of activity. Investigators began to carefully dig in the area where the dogs had alerted. For hours they worked in tense silence, every shovelful of dirt carrying the hope of finding answers. Then, buried several feet below the surface, they found something, a small tattered child's shoe. Rivera held it in his hand, examining the worn canvas and faded stitching. It was the kind of shoe a girl like Emily might have worn. It was a clue, but it wasn't the definitive answer they needed. Despite extensive digging, no remains were found. Thomas, a retired soldier with a commanding presence, had always been known for his strict demeanor. But as Rivera pressed him for answers, a darker and more complex picture of Thomas began to emerge, one that hinted at a volatile temper and a possible connection to Emily's mysterious fate. During an intense interview, Thomas initially denied any wrongdoing, insisting that Emily had simply run away. But under Rivera's persistent questioning, cracks began to form in his story. Thomas admitted that he and Emily had argued the night she disappeared, a revelation that sent a chill through the room. According to Thomas, the argument began when he discovered the family dog gravely ill in the kitchen. Believing that Emily had poisoned the animal, Thomas became enraged.
"I was furious," Thomas said, his voice trembling slightly as he recounted the events. "I confronted her, and she didn't deny it. She just stood there, like she didn't care." Thomas acknowledged that the situation quickly escalated into a heated confrontation. He described a tense moment when emotions ran high during the argument. "She tried to run out of the house," he recalled, gesturing as he spoke. "I reached for her before she got to the door. There was chaos with her kicking and screaming." Rivera noticed something unsettling about Thomas's account. As he described the incident, Thomas's hands mimicked a martial arts-style striking motion, a detail that raised red flags. "Where did you hit her?" Rivera asked, his voice steady but firm. Thomas hesitated before answering. "In the upper chest," he said, but then added, "It might have slipped. I could have hit her throat." The admission sent shockwaves through the investigation. Thomas's account was the closest thing to a confession Rivera had heard, and it painted a grim picture of what might have happened that night. But it was what Thomas said next that truly unsettled Rivera. "My wife told me later that night," Thomas continued, "that she saw something in my eyes. She said I wasn't myself, that I looked like I was possessed." Rivera leaned in, sensing that Thomas was on the verge of revealing something significant. "Possessed?" he repeated, urging Thomas to elaborate. "She said I had a demon in me," Thomas replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "That I wasn't in control. I don't even remember everything that happened." The room fell silent as Thomas's words hung in the air. Rivera couldn't help but feel a mix of disbelief and frustration. While Thomas seemed to be admitting to something, his reliance on the idea of being possessed created a murky narrative that made it difficult to discern fact from fiction. Still, Rivera saw it as a veiled confession, a way for Thomas to acknowledge his role in Emily's disappearance without fully taking responsibility. "I didn't kill her," Thomas insisted, his voice rising. "But if there was a demon in me, maybe it did." For Rivera, Thomas's statements presented a troubling dilemma. On one hand, they pointed to a possible homicide fueled by anger and violence. On the other hand, they were riddled with ambiguity, leaving investigators without the concrete evidence needed to move forward. Without a body or corroborating witnesses, the case remained frustratingly stuck in a gray area. As Rivera reflected on the interview, he couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas's account, however fragmented and distorted, was a key piece of the puzzle. "He knows more than he's saying," Rivera later remarked. "He's dancing around the truth, but he's not ready to admit it outright." Thomas's admission added another layer of complexity to an already baffling case. It revealed the depths of dysfunction within the Lane household and hinted at a tragic end for Emily Grace. Yet, without solid evidence, it remained just that, a hint. For Rivera and his team, the challenge was clear. They needed more than words to bring justice for Emily. They needed proof, and they were determined to find it. An Unexpected Turn, 2003. For over 2 decades, Emily Grace's disappearance had remained an open wound for her sister, Sarah Collins. Despite her relentless pursuit of answers, the case seemed to be moving in agonizing slow motion. Detective Michael Rivera had unearthed disturbing details about the Lane family in Emily's final days, but there were still no definitive answers. Every promising lead ended with more questions than answers, and the lack of tangible evidence, most notably a body, kept justice out of reach. It was as if Emily had simply vanished into thin air. Then, in November 2003, something entirely unexpected happened. Detective Rivera received a call that changed everything. A woman claiming to be Emily Grace had been discovered alive during a routine traffic stop in Phoenix, Arizona. The officer who pulled over the vehicle ran her identification, which matched the name Emily Grace, a name that had long since been entered into the National Missing Persons database. When Rivera first heard the news, his initial reaction was disbelief. How could Emily, whom so many, including her stepfather, believed to be dead, suddenly reappear? "It felt like someone had dropped a ghost in my lap," Rivera later admitted. All the evidence we had gathered pointed to foul play, to something sinister. And now this woman was saying, "Here I am, I'm alive, it didn't make sense." Meeting Emily Grace, Rivera flew to Phoenix to meet the woman, who was now in her mid-30s. She introduced herself as Emily Grace and presented an Arizona state identification card that had been issued just weeks earlier. Her physical appearance bore a resemblance to Emily's childhood photos, enough to create a plausible connection. But as Rivera began questioning her, doubts crept into his mind. Her story was inconsistent, filled with vague recollections and long stretches of time she couldn't account for. She claimed to have run away from the Lane household as a teenager, escaping what she described as a toxic and abusive environment. From there, she said she lived off the grid, moving from town to town, doing odd jobs, and avoiding any situation that might require official identification. It was only recently, she explained, that she decided to resurface and claim her true identity. To some, her story might have seemed like a tale of resilience, a young girl escaping an abusive home and surviving against the odds. But to Rivera, it felt incomplete, even contrived. She was saying all the right things, he later reflected, but something about it felt rehearsed, like she knew what we wanted to hear. The first red flags. One of the first inconsistencies that Rivera noticed was her accent. The woman spoke with a pronounced Southern drawl, which seemed out of place for someone who had spent most of her early life in California. When asked about it, she explained that she had lived in the South for several years, though records later showed she had only spent a brief period there as a child. Linguistic experts later concluded that it would have been nearly impossible for her to acquire such a strong accent without spending her formative years in the region. Another red flag was her lack of detailed memories about her early life. When Rivera asked her about the seaside neighborhood where the Lane family had lived, her answers were vague and noncommittal. She couldn't recall the layout of the house or even the names of childhood friends. For someone who claimed to be Emily Grace, Rivera said, she didn't seem to know much about Emily's life. Perhaps most troubling of all was her reaction when Rivera brought up the family dog, a pivotal detail in the case. According to multiple accounts, the argument between Emily and her stepfather on the night she disappeared centered around the dog, which had mysteriously fallen ill. When asked about this, the woman seemed confused, claiming she had no memory of the incident. "That was a big red flag for me," Rivera said. "The dog was such a critical part of the story, and she had no idea what I was talking about." DNA testing. Despite these inconsistencies, Rivera knew he couldn't dismiss her claims outright. If she truly was Emily Grace, her reappearance would be a miraculous turn of events. But if she wasn't, it raised an entirely different set of questions. Who was she, and why was she pretending to be Emily? To settle the matter, Rivera ordered a DNA test. Samples were collected from the woman and compared to those of Margaret Lane, Emily's biological mother. Rivera fully expected the results to confirm his suspicions that this woman was an imposter. But when the results came back, they told a different story. The woman's DNA was a match. It was like the ground shifted beneath me, Rivera admitted. Everything we thought we knew about this case was suddenly in question. The skepticism persists. Even with the DNA evidence, skepticism persisted. For Sarah Collins and Lila Harper, the woman's behavior didn't align with their memories of Emily. "She didn't feel like my sister," Sarah said. "There was something off about her. Her mannerisms, the way she talked, even the way she carried herself. It just didn't add up." The woman herself didn't help matters. She often seemed defensive and evasive during conversations, as if she were guarding a secret. At one point, she sent Rivera an email with a cryptic message: "I've been lying to you about who I am." When confronted about it, she dismissed the email as a misunderstanding, claiming she had been struggling with self-doubt. Rivera also couldn't ignore the timing of her reappearance. The Arizona ID she carried had been issued shortly after the investigation into Emily's disappearance had been reopened. "It felt too convenient," he said. Almost like someone was trying to throw us off the trail. A theory emerges. As doubts about the woman's identity grew, a new theory began to take shape. Some investigators speculated that she might be Emily's secret half-sister. A child Margaret Lane had given up for adoption before marrying Thomas. According to this theory, Margaret and Thomas had sought out the half-sister to impersonate Emily, hoping to deflect suspicion and prevent further scrutiny of their actions in 1981. While this theory was never proven, it gained traction among those who remained unconvinced by the DNA results. "If you look at the bigger picture," Rivera said, "there are a lot of reasons to question her story. The DNA proves a biological connection, but it doesn't necessarily prove she's Emily Grace." Deeper reflections. The case of Emily Grace is a haunting reminder of how elusive the truth can be, even in the age of modern forensics. It raises uncomfortable questions about memory, identity, and the limits of evidence. Can DNA alone tell the full story of a person's life? How do we reconcile conflicting pieces of evidence when they seem to point in opposite directions? For Rivera, the case became a lesson in the complexities of human behavior. "People are messy," he said. "They lie, they forget, they make mistakes. And sometimes, even when you have all the evidence in the world, You still can't be sure. Lingering mysteries. The woman claiming to be Emily Grace eventually moved to Missouri, where she lived out her final years in relative obscurity. She passed away in 2017, leaving behind more questions than answers. Was she truly Emily, the young girl who disappeared in 1981? Or was she someone else, playing a role she had been thrust into for reasons we may never fully understand? For Sarah Collins, the loss of her sister remains a wound that will never fully heal. I wanted closure, she said, but this doesn't feel like closure. It feels like another mystery. Uh, Detective Rivera shares that sentiment. I don't know if we'll ever know the whole truth, he said, but what I do know is that Emily deserved better. Better from her family, better from the system, better from all of us. And that's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. DNA testing, a twist in the mystery. The revelation of a woman claiming to be Emily Grace after more than 2 decades of silence was shocking enough. But the next phase of the investigation, the DNA test, was where the case took an even more perplexing turn. Detective Michael Rivera, the lead investigator, had grown increasingly skeptical of the woman's story. Her inconsistencies, her lack of detailed memories, and her overall demeanor all pointed to a potential fabrication. And yet, when the DNA results came back, they turned everything upside down. The woman was biologically related to Margaret Lane, Emily's mother. For Rivera, the result was both a breakthrough and a conundrum. It didn't fit with anything we'd uncovered up to that point, he later reflected. We had spent months building a case that suggested Emily had likely been the victim of foul play. And now, here was this woman saying, "I'm her," and the science was backing her up. The role of DNA in the investigation. DNA testing has long been heralded as a near absolute method of establishing biological relationships, and in this case, it confirmed that the woman was Margaret Lane's daughter. But even with this confirmation, doubts lingered. As Rivera pointed out, DNA can tell you who someone is related to, but it can't tell you who they are. This distinction became a focal point of the investigation. While the DNA results proved a biological connection, they didn't explain the woman's behavior, her strange accent, or her lack of familiarity with key details about Emily's life. It was as if she were two people at once, genetically Emily Grace, but someone else entirely in terms of her lived experience. The missing years. One of the most glaring gaps in the woman's story was her account of the years following her supposed disappearance. She claimed to have run away from the Lane household as a teenager, driven by a desperate need to escape the abuse and dysfunction that had defined her childhood. From there, she said she drifted from place to place, avoiding official records and living on the margins of society. While this narrative wasn't implausible, it lacked specificity. The woman couldn't provide details about the towns she had lived in, the people she had met, or the jobs she had held. When pressed for answers, she often deflected, saying she had blocked out much of her past due to trauma. "I don't remember everything," she told Rivera. "I was just trying to survive." Her vague answers left Rivera and his team frustrated. "It's one thing to forget specific dates or addresses," he said, "but to not remember entire chapters of your life, it just didn't sit right." This fog of memory, or the appearance of one, also raised questions about the role trauma might have played in shaping the woman's account. Psychological experts consulted during the investigation noted that trauma can indeed cause memory gaps, particularly when someone has experienced prolonged periods of stress or abuse. But they also cautioned that memory gaps could be used as a convenient excuse to avoid scrutiny. The truth is, we may never know how much of her story is real and how much is fabricated, Rivera admitted. Family reactions for Emily's surviving sisters, Sarah Collins and Lila Harper, the DNA results were bittersweet. On one hand, they provided a sense of closure, or at least the possibility of it. But on the other hand, the woman standing before them didn't feel like the Emily they had known and loved. She didn't act like Emily, Sarah said. Her mannerisms were different. Her speech was different. Even the way she looked at us felt unfamiliar. I wanted to believe it was her, but my gut was telling me something else. Lila shared similar feelings of unease. She had vivid memories of growing up with Emily, memories that she felt were impossible to fake. Yet when she tried to connect with the woman claiming to be her sister, the bond wasn't there. It was like talking to a stranger, Lila said. She knew some things about our family, but it wasn't enough. It felt like she was guessing. The tension between the sisters and the woman was further exacerbated by her reluctance to engage with them on a deeper level. While Sarah and Lila wanted to reminisce about their childhood and fill in the gaps of Emily's story, the woman seemed disinterested, even dismissive. She didn't seem to care about reconnecting, Sarah said. It was like she was just going through the motions. The timing of her reappearance. Another aspect of the case that fueled skepticism was the timing of the woman's reappearance. Her Arizona state ID had been issued only weeks after the investigation into Emily's disappearance had been reopened. To Rivera, this felt suspiciously convenient. It was almost like someone tipped her off, he said, like she knew we were looking and decided to show up before we could dig any deeper. Some investigators theorized that the woman might have been coached or even coerced into claiming Emily's identity. They pointed to the possibility of financial motives, such as accessing Emily's inheritance or Social Security benefits. While no concrete evidence of such a scheme was ever uncovered, the timing of her reappearance remained a lingering question, a complicated truth. As the investigation wore on, Rivera found himself grappling with a complex and unsettling truth. The woman might very well be Emily Grace, but that didn't mean her story was entirely honest. People lie for all kinds of reasons, he said. Sometimes it's to protect themselves, sometimes it's to protect others, and sometimes it's because they don't know how to tell the truth anymore. This complexity was compounded by the fact that the Lane household had been such a toxic environment. If the woman truly was as Emily, her reluctance to share her story could be a reflection of the pain and trauma she had endured. But if she wasn't, her behavior could be seen as an elaborate act, one that had somehow managed to deceive even the most advanced forensic tools. Deeper reflections. The case of Emily Grace underscores the limits of evidence and the ways in which human behavior can defy easy categorization. DNA testing, while a powerful tool, is not a magic bullet. It can establish biological relationships, but it cannot account for the complexities of identity, memory, and lived experience. For Rivera, the investigation became a deeply personal journey. I went into this case thinking it would be straightforward, he said. But the more I learned, the more I realized how messy the truth can be. People aren't just data points on a chart. They're complicated, unpredictable, and sometimes downright contradictory. This insight was echoed by the psychological experts who reviewed the case. They pointed out that the intersection of trauma, survival, and identity is a murky one, full of gray areas that defy easy answers. The human mind is capable of incredible things, one expert said. It can adapt, it can protect, and it can deceive, even itself. The aftermath. In the end, the DNA results forced the investigation to take a new direction. What had once seemed like a straightforward mystery of a missing girl became a complex and layered narrative about identity, trauma, and the search for truth. For Sarah and Lila, the answers they sought remained elusive. Was the woman truly their sister, or was she someone else, drawn into the orbit of their family's tragedy for reasons they might never understand? For Rivera, the case left him with more questions than answers. I don't know if we'll ever know the whole story, he said, but what I do know is that Emily deserved better. Better from her family, better from the system, and better from all of us. The woman claiming to be Emily Grace eventually passed away in 2017, taking many of the case's secrets with her. For the people who had spent years searching for answers, her death marked the end of one chapter, but left the story far from complete. And for those who knew Emily, the question that haunted them most remained. If she wasn't the real Emily Grace, then where was the little girl who disappeared so many years ago? A conspiracy theory, a secret sister, or a sinister plan? The emergence of a woman claiming to be Emily Grace after 2 decades of silence was shocking enough. But for many involved in the case, including Detective Michael Rivera and Emily's sisters, Sarah Collins and Lila Harper, the unanswered questions surrounding her reappearance were too numerous to ignore. While DNA testing confirmed that the woman was biologically connected to Margaret Lane, Emily's mother, doubts about her identity persisted. As investigators probed deeper, an unsettling theory began to emerge. What if the woman wasn't Emily at all, but a secret half-sister enlisted to impersonate her? This theory gained traction among those still unconvinced by the DNA results, especially considering the peculiar timing of the woman's reappearance. Why would she show up just as the investigation into Emily's disappearance had been reopened? Some speculated that the woman might have been a hidden half-sister, perhaps from an earlier relationship Margaret Lane had before her marriage to Thomas. The idea was that Margaret and Thomas might have orchestrated a plan to use the woman, whether knowingly or not, as part of a larger scheme to deflect suspicion from themselves and avoid the consequences of their past actions. The theory raised more questions than answers, though. Why would the Lane family go to such lengths? Was it about protecting a secret or something more sinister, like preventing the truth from being exposed? It was also troubling to think about the woman's potential role in a carefully constructed lie, particularly given the inconsistent details about her childhood and the lack of a convincing narrative about the years she claimed to have spent living off the grid. For Rivera, the theory only deepened the mystery. If this woman wasn't Emily, he said, then who was she, and what role did she play in the bigger picture? It suggested a web of deception that might have gone beyond a simple case of mistaken identity, one that could involve manipulation, secrecy, and an elaborate cover-up that no one had fully uncovered yet. A troubling possibility. This theory was rooted in the complexities of Margaret Lane's life. Margaret had a history of tumultuous relationships, and investigators learned of rumors that she may have had a child before Emily's birth, a child given up for adoption or raised separately from the Lane family. Could this woman, who resurfaced just as the investigation into Emily's disappearance intensified, be that child? And if so, was her appearance a coincidence or part of a calculated effort to cover up the truth about what happened to Emily in 1981? Detective Rivera, initially hesitant to entertain such a far-fetched idea, eventually found himself unable to dismiss it entirely. There were just too many things that didn't add up, he later explained. Her accent, her gaps in memory, the timing of her reappearance, it all felt too convenient. And then you start asking yourself, if this isn't Emily, who benefits from her saying she is? The answer to that question pointed squarely at Margaret and Thomas Lane. At the time of Emily's disappearance, the Lane family had been receiving Social Security checks on Emily's behalf, benefits tied to the death of her biological father. If Emily had died in 1981, those payments would have stopped. But by maintaining the appearance that Emily was alive, the family could continue collecting the money, a financial incentive that cast a shadow over their already suspicious behavior. This financial motivation added a disturbing layer to the case. Was it possible that the Lane family had orchestrated the reappearance of a long-lost half-sister to claim Emily's identity in order to keep the Social Security checks flowing? If the woman wasn't truly Emily, Was she a pawn in a larger scheme designed to conceal the family's dark secrets and secure their financial future? As the theory unfolded, it painted a picture of a meticulously planned deception, one that stretched the boundaries of what might have been considered plausible. Rivera found himself confronting a harsh reality. Sometimes the pursuit of justice reveals truths more unsettling than anyone could have imagined. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the woman's reappearance might not have been an accidental twist of fate, but rather a key piece in a long-buried conspiracy: motives and manipulation. If the woman wasn't Emily, then Margaret and Thomas Lane's alleged involvement in orchestrating her appearance suggested a level of manipulation that was as chilling as it was calculated. Investigators speculated that the Lanes might have tracked down the secret half-sister and convinced her to assume Emily's identity. Whether they did so out of fear of being prosecuted for Emily's disappearance or to protect their financial interests, the theory painted a deeply troubling picture of a family willing to exploit their darkest secrets for personal gain. For Sarah and Lila, this possibility was devastating. "If she's not Emily," Sarah said, "then that means our mom and stepdad lied to us, not just once, but over and over again. It means they cared more about protecting themselves than they did about finding out what really happened to her." Evidence supporting the theory. While no definitive proof of this conspiracy ever emerged, there were several pieces of circumstantial evidence that gave it credibility. The accent. Linguistic experts noted that the woman's southern drawl was inconsistent with Emily's upbringing in California. The accent was so pronounced that it seemed unlikely she could have acquired it in her brief time living in the South as a child. This detail suggested the woman's formative years were spent elsewhere, possibly in an entirely different household. The timing of reappearance. The Arizona state ID the woman carried had been issued just weeks after the investigation into Emily's disappearance was reopened. This coincidence raised questions about whether her sudden reappearance was a genuine act or a preemptive move orchestrated by someone trying to derail the case. The secret email. At one point, the woman sent Detective Rivera an email admitting, "I've been lying to you about who I am." While she later dismissed the email as a mistake, it fueled suspicions that she might be hiding the full truth about her identity. Family connections. Investigators uncovered evidence suggesting that Margaret Lane may have had relationships and children outside her marriage to Thomas Lane. These discoveries lent weight to the possibility that the woman was a half-sister rather than Emily herself. The emotional toll. The conspiracy theory, while plausible, added another layer of pain and confusion to an already heartbreaking case. For Sarah and Lila, the idea that their mother and stepfather might have gone to such lengths to cover up the truth about Emily was almost too much to bear. "It's one thing to lose your sister," Sarah said. "It's another to realize the people who were supposed to protect her might have been the ones who let her down the most." This sentiment echoed throughout the investigation. Detective Rivera often found himself grappling with the moral and emotional weight of the case. "It's easy to think of these things in terms of evidence and facts," he said. "But at the end of the day, we're talking about a little girl who disappeared and a family that fell apart because of it. It's not just a mystery, it's a tragedy." Broader implications. The conspiracy theory surrounding Emily's case highlights broader issues about the nature of truth and justice. In cases like this, where evidence is scarce and motives are murky, investigators are often left piecing together fragments of a story that may never be fully understood. "Sometimes the truth is messy," Rivera said. "It's not a clean answer tied up in a bow. It's a lot of gray areas and unanswered questions." This complexity is further compounded by the role of trauma in shaping memory and behavior. If the woman truly was Emily, her reluctance to engage with her past could be a reflection of the pain she endured. But if she wasn't, her behavior could also be seen as the result of manipulation or even self-preservation. In either case, the psychological toll of the case extended far beyond the immediate family, affecting everyone who became involved. Unanswered questions. To this day, the conspiracy theory remains just that, a theory. There is no definitive proof that the woman was a secret half-sister, nor is there any evidence to conclusively disprove her claim to be Emily Grace. What remains are the lingering questions. If she wasn't Emily, why did she come forward? If she was Emily, why couldn't she remember critical details about her early life? And most haunting of all, if Emily truly died in 1981, who was responsible and why has the truth remained buried for so long? A case that defies resolution. In the end, the conspiracy theory is a reflection of the broader uncertainty that defines Emily Grace's case. It's a story about identity, survival, and the lengths people will go to protect themselves or their secrets. For Sarah and Lila, the truth, whatever it may be, remains elusive. I just want to know what happened to my sister, Sarah said. Whether she's alive or not, I want the truth. I think we all deserve that. Detective Rivera shares that sentiment, though he acknowledges that some mysteries may never be solved. There's a part of me that still wonders, he said. Did we find Emily Grace, or did we just find another question? This haunting uncertainty underscores the human cost of unresolved cases like this one. For every piece of evidence and every theory, there is a family left to grapple with what might have been. And for Emily Grace, or whoever the woman truly was, the truth may forever remain just out of reach. If she wasn't Emily, why did she come forward? If she was Emily, why couldn't she remember critical details about her early life? And most haunting of all, if Emily truly died in 1981, who was responsible and why has the truth remained buried for so long? A case that defies resolution. In the end, the conspiracy theory is a reflection of the broader uncertainty that defines Emily Grace's case. It's a story about identity, survival, and the lengths people will go to protect themselves or their secrets. For Sarah and Lila, the truth, whatever it may be, remains elusive. I just want to know what happened to my sister, Sarah said. Whether she's alive or not, I want the truth. I think we all deserve that. Detective Rivera shares that sentiment, though he acknowledges that some mysteries may never be solved. There's a part of me that still wonders, he said. Did we find Emily Grace? Or did we just find another question? This haunting uncertainty underscores the human cost of unresolved cases like this one. For every piece of evidence and every theory, there is a family left to grapple with what might have been. And for Emily Grace, or whoever the woman truly was, the truth may forever remain just out of reach. If she wasn't Emily, why did she come forward? If she was Emily, why couldn't she remember critical details about her early life? And most haunting of all, if Emily truly died in 1981, who was responsible and why has the truth remained buried for so long? A case that defies resolution. In the end, the conspiracy theory is a reflection of the broader uncertainty that defines Emily Grace's case. It's a story about identity, survival, and the lengths people will go to protect themselves or their secrets. For Sarah and Lila, the truth, whatever it may be, remains elusive. I just want to know what happened to my sister, Sarah said. Whether she's alive or not, I want the truth. I think we all deserve that. Detective Rivera shares that sentiment, though he acknowledges that some mysteries may never be solved. There's a part of me that still wonders, he said. Did we find Emily Grace, or did we just find another question? This haunting uncertainty underscores the human cost of unresolved cases like this one. For every piece of evidence and every theory, there is a family left to grapple with what might have been. And for Emily Grace, or whoever the woman truly was, the truth may forever remain just out of reach. What the photo revealed and what it didn't. The photograph offered a glimpse of Emily's life after her disappearance, but it also highlighted the limitations of physical evidence. While it confirmed her presence in 1982, it didn't explain how she got there, who she was with, or why she remained silent. In many ways, the photo was both a blessing and a curse, a tantalizing hint of the truth, but one that left critical questions unanswered. Rivera reflected on the duality of evidence like this. In cases like these, you're always walking a fine line, he said. You're grateful for any clue that moves the case forward, but you're also frustrated because no single piece of evidence can tell the whole story. It's like trying to complete a puzzle when you don't even know what the final picture is supposed to look like. Theories and speculation. The discovery of the photo fueled new theories about Emily's disappearance and reappearance. Some investigators speculated that Emily had been taken in by someone who cared for her but kept her hidden for reasons unknown. Others suggested that she might have been trafficked or coerced into a situation where reaching out to her family was impossible. There was also the possibility that Emily had chosen to disappear. Growing up in the chaotic and abusive Lane household, she might have seen running away as her only escape. If the photo was any indication, she had survived, at least for a time. But survival doesn't always equate to safety, and the life she led after leaving home remained a mystery. For Sarah, this theory was the hardest to accept. If she was alive, if she was out there, Sarah said, then why didn't she let me know? I would have done anything to help her. I would have gone anywhere to find her. A reflection on survival. The photograph also raised broader questions about survival and identity. If Emily had survived after her disappearance, what kind of life had she lived? Did she find peace, or was she trapped in a different kind of struggle? These questions underscored the complexities of cases like Emily's, where the lines between victimhood and agency are often blurred. One of the hardest things about this case, Rivera said, is coming to terms with the idea that survival doesn't always mean resolution. Even if Emily was alive, it doesn't mean her story had a happy ending. This insight highlights a sobering truth about missing persons cases. The assumption is often that finding the person or evidence of their survival will bring closure, but the reality is far more complicated. Survival can come with its own set of traumas, its own layers of mystery. What the photo meant for the case. In the context of the investigation, the photo was both a breakthrough and a roadblock. It proved that Emily had been alive after her supposed disappearance, which cast doubt on some of the darker theories about her fate. But it also muddied the waters by introducing new uncertainties. If she had been alive in 1982, what had happened to her since? And why did the woman who came forward in 2003 struggle to account for that time? For Rivera, the photo became a symbol of the case's complexity. This picture should have given us answers, he said, but instead, it just gave us more questions. A haunting reminder. In the end, the photograph of Emily Grace stands as both a clue and a haunting reminder of everything that remains unknown. It captures a moment in time, a fragment of a life that has been lost to speculation and silence. For Sarah and Lila, it's a bittersweet keepsake, a tangible connection to a sister they may never fully understand. As Rivera reflected on the case, he acknowledged the limitations of even the most compelling evidence. This photo is a piece of the puzzle, he said, but it's just one piece, and until we find the others, the full picture will always elude us. This tension between discovery and uncertainty is perhaps the defining characteristic of Emily's case. It's a story where every answer leads to more questions, where the truth remains tantalizingly out of reach. And for those who loved Emily, the photograph is both a blessing and a burden, a reminder of what was lost and of everything that might still be found. Resolution, a case closed but not forgotten. After decades of speculation, investigation, and unanswered questions, the case of Emily Grace took an unexpected turn toward resolution. The reappearance of a woman claiming to be Emily, combined with the results of DNA testing and corroborating evidence, led authorities to formally close the case. Yet for many, including Emily's sisters, Sarah Collins and Lila Harper, the resolution felt anything but complete. The story of Emily Grace remained a tangled web of mystery, leaving behind a legacy of unresolved emotions and lingering doubts. DNA closes the case. The DNA results were conclusive. The woman who resurfaced in 2003 was biologically linked to Margaret Lane, Emily's mother. This scientific evidence seemed to validate her claim to be Emily Grace, the girl who had disappeared from Seaside, California, more than 2 decades earlier. For the investigators, it was a critical piece of the puzzle, offering the first concrete proof in a case that had been defined by speculation. Detective Michael Rivera, who had been at the forefront of the investigation, felt a mix of relief and frustration. On one hand, the DNA gave us a definitive answer, he said. It told us this woman was Margaret's daughter, which made her Emily. But on the other hand, it didn't explain everything else. Her behavior, her memories, the inconsistencies in her story. The science gave us a name, but it didn't give us the truth. This distinction between facts and truth became a central theme in the case's resolution. While the DNA provided an answer, it didn't unravel the deeper mysteries surrounding Emily's life, disappearance, and eventual reappearance. A strained reunion after the case was officially closed, the woman claiming to be Emily Grace moved in with her sister, Sarah Collins, in an effort to reconnect and rebuild their relationship. But the reunion was far from the joyful reconciliation Sarah had imagined. It was like living with a stranger, Sarah admitted. She looked like Emily, but she didn't act like her. There were moments where I thought, maybe this really isn't her. The tension between the sisters was palpable. Sarah, desperate for answers, often pressed the woman for details about her life after leaving home, but the responses were vague and evasive. She didn't seem interested in talking about the past, Sarah said. She just wanted to move forward, but I couldn't do that without understanding what had happened. For Lila Harper, the doubts ran even deeper. She couldn't shake the feeling that the woman wasn't Emily at all. I kept waiting for some moment of recognition, some little thing that would make me say, yes, this is her. But it never came, Leela said. It was like she was playing a part, but the role didn't quite fit. The woman's perspective. The woman herself seemed equally unsettled by the situation. While she insisted she was Emily Grace, she often expressed frustration at having to prove her identity. It's exhausting, she told Rivera during one of their final conversations. I've spent my whole life trying to survive, and now I'm spending all my time trying to convince people of who I am. Her words highlighted the emotional toll of the case, not just for the investigators and family members, but for the woman at its center. If she truly was Emily, her reluctance to engage with her past could be understood as a coping mechanism, a way of protecting herself from the pain of her childhood. But if she wasn't, her defensiveness could be seen as a calculated attempt to maintain her story. Either way, her behavior added another layer of complexity to an already convoluted narrative. Unanswered questions. Despite the case being closed, many questions remained unresolved. If the woman was Emily Grace, why had she stayed hidden for so long? Why didn't she reach out to her family sooner? And what happened during the years she couldn't account for? For Rivera, these unanswered questions were a source of frustration. We had the DNA, we had the photo, we had everything we needed to close the case, he said. But it still didn't feel like we had the whole story. And maybe we never will. This sentiment was shared by Sarah, who struggled to reconcile the evidence with her own doubts. The DNA says she's Emily, but my heart says something else, Sarah said. I want to believe it's her. I really do. But there's a part of me that can't let go of the idea that something isn't right. The role of evidence versus intuition. The case of Emily Grace highlights a recurring tension in criminal investigations. the conflict between hard evidence and human intuition. The DNA results were irrefutable, yet they couldn't explain the discrepancies in the woman's story or the unease felt by those closest to Emily. This case taught me that evidence can only take you so far, Rivera reflected. It's a critical piece of the puzzle, but it's not the whole picture. Human beings are complex, and sometimes the answers aren't as clear-cut as we'd like them to be. This complexity is part of what makes cases like Emily's so haunting. Even when the facts seem to point in one direction, the human element, the emotions, the memories, the doubts, can pull you in another. It's a reminder that truth is often multifaceted, layered with nuance and contradiction. Lingering doubts and reflections. In the years following the case's closure, Sarah and Lila continued to grapple with their feelings about the woman claiming to be their sister. Sarah eventually came to accept her, though not without reservations. "I decided that even if she isn't Emily, she needs someone," Sarah said. "Maybe that's what Emily would have wanted, for us to take care of her, just like I always wanted to take care of my sister." Lila, however, remained skeptical. "I think the real Emily is gone," she said, "and maybe we'll never know what really happened to her. But I can't make peace with this version of her because it doesn't feel like the truth." For Rivera, the case remains one of the most challenging of his career. "There's a part of me that wishes we could have done more," he admitted, "but at the same time, I know we did everything we could. Sometimes that has to be enough." A case that stays with you. The resolution of Emily Grace's case was in many ways unsatisfying. It provided answers, but not the kind that bring closure. It offered resolution, but not in the way anyone had hoped, and it left behind a trail of questions that may never be answered. Yet, for all its ambiguity, the case also serves as a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. Whether the woman was truly Emily or someone else, her survival is a testament to the strength it takes to endure unimaginable circumstances. And for Sarah, Lila, and the rest of Emily's family, it's a reminder of the importance of hope, even when the truth feels out of reach. As Rivera put it, this case wasn't just about finding Emily. It was about finding meaning in the search, even when the answers weren't what we expected. Lingering mysteries, questions that refuse to fade. Even after the case of Emily Grace was officially closed, the story felt far from over. The resolution, based largely on DNA evidence, provided a biological connection between the woman who reappeared in 2003 and Emily's family, but it left a gaping hole in the narrative. There was still no clear explanation for Emily's disappearance, no definitive timeline of her life after she vanished, and no answers to the troubling inconsistencies that had haunted investigators from the start. For everyone involved, Emily's family, Detective Michael Rivera, and even the woman claiming to be Emily, the case remained a puzzle, with missing pieces that would likely never be found. The unanswered questions continued to echo in the minds of those who had lived through the mystery. Why did Emily, if she was alive, stay hidden for so long? What happened to her in the years between her disappearance and her reappearance? And most unsettling of all, if this woman was Emily, how could so many aspects of her identity remain elusive, even to those who had known her best? As time passed, these mysteries began to weave into the fabric of the case itself. A constant reminder that some stories, no matter how hard we try to solve them, resist closure. The echoes of Emily Grace's disappearance continue to haunt the lives of her family and the investigators who worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. This unresolved uncertainty stands as a testament to the complex nature of human lives, where the past is often shrouded in layers of trauma, survival, and secrets that even the best efforts of science and reason can't fully reveal. For those left behind, the search for answers persists, even if they're never fully attained. The role of the cadaver dogs. Who was buried? One of the most perplexing elements of the case involved the cadaver dogs. In 2002, during a search of the Lane family's old backyard, the dogs had alerted to a specific spot, indicating the presence of human remains. Detectives dug at the site with their hearts pounding, expecting to find Emily. Instead, they uncovered a single child's shoe, but no body. The significance of the dog's reaction couldn't be ignored. Rivera was convinced they had detected something. Dogs don't lie, he often said. Their instincts are sharper than ours. If they hit on something, there's a reason for it. But what that reason was remained a mystery. Was a body once buried there and later moved? If so, where was it taken and who was responsible? The discovery of the shoe added another layer of complexity. It was small, weathered, and unmistakably child-sized. But was it Emily's? Investigators couldn't definitively say, and the lack of other evidence left them with more questions than answers. That shoe haunts me, Rivera admitted. It's a symbol of what we're missing, not just physically, but in terms of the truth. The lingering mystery of the cadaver dogs underscores a deeper frustration in cases like these. Even the best tools and instincts can only go so far without concrete evidence. It's a sobering reminder that, despite advances in technology and forensics, some questions may remain unanswered forever. The backyard and beyond, was the body moved? Years later, another strange twist emerged. In 2008, during an unrelated investigation, cadaver dogs hit on a site near a home where the Lane family had lived after Emily's disappearance. The location was miles away from their seaside backyard, but the dogs' reaction was strikingly similar. Once again, investigators dug, and once again, they found nothing. This second hit raised an unsettling possibility. Had Emily's body been moved not once, but twice? And if so, what did that say about the people who might have been involved? If someone went to those lengths to hide her, Rivera speculated, it suggests a level of planning and intent that's hard to reconcile. It's not just a crime of passion, it's something much darker. The idea of a body being moved multiple times is both chilling and tragic. It speaks to the lengths someone might go to erase evidence, to rewrite a narrative, and to avoid accountability. But it also highlights the resilience of investigators who refused to let the case rest even when the trail grew cold. This strange twist added further complexity to an already confounding case, and it underscored the emotional toll such investigations take, not just on the family left searching for answers, but also on those dedicated to solving the mystery, even when it feels like the truth is slipping further out of reach. Family silence, the mystery of Margaret and Thomas Lane. At the heart of the lingering mysteries is the silence of Emily's mother, Margaret Lane, and her stepfather, Thomas Lane. From the beginning, their behavior had raised red flags. They never reported Emily missing, continued to cash her Social Security checks after her disappearance, and discouraged her siblings from asking questions about her. Margaret's interviews with investigators were particularly unsettling. She often seemed evasive, offering vague or contradictory answers that only deepened suspicions. At one point, she admitted that sometimes you do things in your past that come back to haunt you. It was a cryptic statement, but one that hinted at a deeper truth she might never be willing to reveal. Thomas, meanwhile, had made disturbing comments during his own interviews, including an admission that he had been furious with Emily the night she disappeared. He described striking her and claimed he couldn't remember what happened afterward. Most chillingly, he mentioned that his wife once told him he looked possessed that night, as if a demon had taken over. While he denied killing Emily, his words left little room for comfort. The silence of Margaret and Thomas Lane speaks volumes about the dynamics of the family. Whether out of guilt, fear, or self-preservation, their refusal to speak openly about Emily's disappearance ensured that key pieces of the puzzle would remain missing. It's a reminder of how silence can be as powerful and as damaging as any lie. Family silence, The Mystery of Margaret and Thomas Lane. At the heart of the lingering mysteries is the silence of Emily's mother, Margaret Lane, and her stepfather, Thomas Lane. From the beginning, their behavior had raised red flags. They never reported Emily missing, continued to cash her Social Security checks after her disappearance, and discouraged her siblings from asking questions about her. Margaret's interviews with investigators were particularly unsettling. She often seemed evasive, offering vague or contradictory answers that only deepened suspicions. At one point, she admitted that sometimes you do things in your past that come back to haunt you. It was a cryptic statement, but one that hinted at a deeper truth she might never be willing to reveal. Thomas, meanwhile, had made disturbing comments during his own interviews, including an admission that he had been furious with Emily the night she disappeared. He described striking her and claimed he couldn't remember what happened afterward. Most chillingly, he mentioned that his wife once told him he looked possessed that night, as if a demon had taken over. While he denied killing Emily, his words left little room for comfort. The silence of Margaret and Thomas Lane speaks volumes about the dynamics of the family. Whether out of guilt, fear, or self-preservation, their refusal to speak openly about Emily's disappearance ensured that key pieces of the puzzle would remain missing. It's a reminder of how silence can be as powerful and as damaging as any lie. A legacy of unanswered questions. In the end, the case of Emily Grace is defined as much by its unanswered questions as by the answers it provided. It's a story of resilience and heartbreak, of persistence and doubt, of science and intuition. It's a story that asks us to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that some mysteries may never be fully solved, and that closure, in the truest sense, is often elusive. For those who loved Emily, the lingering mysteries are a source of pain, but also a reminder of her life and the impact she had on those around her. Emily's story didn't end the way we wanted it to, Sarah said, but it's still a story worth telling, because even in the darkest moments, there's light, and even when the answers aren't there, the love remains.